Hi, welcome back to the podcast. We're in a bit of a name limbo right now, so I guess call it whatever you want, and we'll do the official rebranding uh, probably in 2 weeks' time from when this comes up. As usual, this is Swedish teenage heartthrob Karl speaking. Uh, Here with another episode. We still don't have Aska back. Aska's kind of busy with a lot of things right now, but should be back for the next episode. So for this episode, I decided to bring on another guest who I can only describe as being unfortunately British. Uh, Hi, Ali. Do you want to introduce yourself a bit?
Hey, I'm Ali. I am indeed, unfortunately, British. I am a trainee journalist and podcaster. I have a movie show called Extra Cinema Club where we watch malign genre films. Yeah, that's my deal.
Yeah. So, Ali, you're a bit of a movie guy. I
Yeah,
guess some would say.
some may say that.
Yeah, you've got how many movies logged on Letterboxd? A billion?
1700s, yeah, something like that.
Pretty much all movies.
Pretty much all of them. There's a lot less movies than you think there'd be. When you look up how many movies there are on Letterboxd, there's not as many movies as you'd expect.
Yeah, there's like 1701, I think, something
Something
like
like
that.
that.
Yeah, you're getting there. But yeah, so obviously you going on this movie podcast, that's not really a strange thing. But I figured I'd bring you on for a special episode this time where we discuss horror genres in particular. This is partly because I know you're a bit of a horror fanatic.
Yes.
Yeah. I am a horror fanatic as well, listeners will know. But it's also because you are the only horror fanatic that I know. Obviously, Aska, my co-host, uh, horror isn't really Aska's thing. They've expressed that they don't really want to be doing a lot of horror episodes with me, which is fine, obviously. Leather as well, who has also been on the podcast, not a horror guy, which is fine. But I do need to get the horror itch, scratched somehow. So I brought on Ali this time. Like I said, Ali, you're a big horror fan. I'm a big horror
Yeah,
fan. You are probably my senior in terms of horror. I would assume you've seen a couple more horror movies than me.
potentially,
Yeah. Uh, but yeah, and also because horror is like it's such an interesting genre to talk about.
for sure.
Uh, and I imagine it's also an interesting genre to listen to. So that's why we're doing a bit more of a free form episode about just a genre in particular. There are a couple horror movies that I would be interested in talking a bit more in depth on in the
Mhm.
future with people. We floated the Blair Witch Project at some point. There's a
Oh yeah.
bunch more, but for now we'll just do some talking about the genre in particular. Uh, so one thing I've been interested in talking to you about is like how you got into horror as a genre because I think everyone has had a brush up with horror at some point. It's
Hmm.
because like for example in my youth, and I imagine in a lot of people's youths, horror is like sort of a test of courage kind of thing. Like
Yeah.
you and your friends get together and you watch horror movies, and no one really wants to watch them, but you also don't want to admit that you don't want to watch them, right? Did you ever
Mhm.
have something like that?
Yeah, I mean, as a kid, I was never like really into horror at all. Like, there were bits I liked, and I think like the first kind of exposure to horror, kind of like horror iconography, is the Indiana Jones movies. Like, all of those movies have like at least one scene of some like gruesome body horror, like Raiders of the
Mm-hmm.
Lost Ark in particular. And I remember watching my dad showing me like Raiders of the Lost Ark and like warning me that oh yeah, there's some gruesome stuff at the end when the Nazi gets his face melted off. It's like and like I remember that like really sticking with me, and it kind
Yeah.
of like messed me up with a lot of stuff. And then seeing like ads for especially like the mid 2000s, seeing ads for Saw and all of that stuff, and it being like even the advertisements being kind of gruesome. was very like striking for me of like, oh god, this movie looks like horrifying. How could I
Hmm.
how could I sit down and watch this? And it's very funny now, like having seen the Saw movies and then being incredibly goofy and being like, wow, I was like dead scared of these, like conceptually as a kid, even not knowing anything about them. Like, and it's like, actually, they're pretty goofy movies.
Yeah,
But
it's
getting,
such a weird thing when you grow up, and
mm,
like it's not even you can look at them from another angle. It's just things don't affect you in the same way because
yeah,
you have like I guess sort of a different understanding of the world. Uh,
yeah, I think the other thing is that the one movie that stands out in my mind that I actually really like a lot, but when I was a kid, I saw advertisements for it. It's a mid 2000s New Zealand horror movie called Black Sheep. It's very kind of like if you've seen um like Peter Jackson's horror movies, like very that sort of vein of like goofy parody esque, but also some like goofy body horror, that sort of thing. But I remember seeing this advert for it as a kid and being absolutely terrified of it because it's a movie about like a flock of sheep that get like infected with a zombie virus essentially and run wild on this like rural New Zealand farm.
yeah,
And just the concept horrified me as a kid. I remember seeing the adverts and just being, and it had very like stereotypical horror advertising. Um, Very funny, like looking back on it. I'm pretty sure the tagline was "The violence of the lambs."
yo, that's so based.
I saw the movie like a couple years ago. I was finally like, oh yeah, I've got to sit down and watch this now. And it's a horror comedy. Like it's incredibly goofy.
Uh huh.
Um, there are jokes about sheep shagging in it, as you'd expect from a New Zealand horror movie
Of
about
course.
zombie sheep. It is very goofy, and same with like the Saw movies. It's like very funny to me that this was like the scariest thing conceptually to me as a kid, and now it's like this is my shit. I love stupid, goofy horror comedies with like gory nonsense in them.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. Like children are afraid of everything almost.
Mm,
Uh, like everyone has experiences with a kids movie that scarred them for life, right? That like
yeah.
it's not a scary movie, but it had some scene of like a bad guy showing up or
Mm.
whatever. I remember as a kid, I accidentally at some point saw a scene from it was probably the first Lord of the Rings movie. Uh, the scene where they're being stalked by Gollum in the
Oh
Mines of
yeah.
Moria. And I remember seeing Gollum, and I just thought he was the freakiest shit ever. And I had
Yeah.
nightmares for probably a year about Gollum, right? And you watch the Lord of the Rings now, and it's like a freaky goblin guy.
Yeah.
He's a funky little dude.
He's a
Same
funky
thing
little
with
dude.
the first Harry Potter movie when he removes the turban.
Oh yeah, yeah.
I was born in 2000, so I was pretty young when I watched that movie. It came out in 2001, so I was probably like 5 when I saw it.
Uh-huh.
Uh, that's also some freaky shit. Yeah, there's something very interesting about that. I think that
Yeah, definitely.
that just like even when you're young, the concept of being scared by media it's kind of unavoidable.
Mm.
But yeah, so at what point do you think it was that you like actively started like watching horror films for enjoyment or consuming any horror media at all, really?
Um, More recent than you'd expect. It was in my second year of uni. I took a module on Gothic fiction.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I adored it. I was obsessed. This was also like quite an emotionally low point for me, so I was like had a lot of time to just sit and watch movies all day, and I got really hooked on horror. Um, and like I was really interested in like the classic formations of horror and like excess is like a concept I absolutely adore, like as being this polar to the sublime, which is at the time of like romantic era poetry of like being blown away by nature and that stuff. The excess is like the fucked up version of that, of just being so overwhelmed by some natural or unnatural force that it's just like renders you incapable of doing anything. It's just such a cool concept. Um, and yeah, I did this module on Gothic fiction. Got obsessed. And then it was at that point I was like, well, there's all these classic horror movies that I've been meaning to watch. I'm gonna do that, and like just didn't stop. I'm still like finding movies that I want to watch, and like finding different like areas of horror that I think are really interesting, and like hit niches that I'm really interested in. But yeah, like it all stems from like taking this gothic fiction class, like not even I guess like 6 years ago now.
Yeah. So you were a movie guy before you were a horror guy.
Yeah, I mean, I got into movies properly like my last year of high school. I went through a lot of high school like hearing about like movies that like everyone had seen that I was like for some reason I hadn't watched. Like I hadn't watched like I still haven't actually watched Pulp Fiction, but Pulp Fiction was one that a lot of my friends would be like, "Oh, Pulp Fiction's the best movie. You've got to watch it." I was like, "Yeah, I'll watch it eventually." And then at some point, I was like, okay, well, there's all these movies I need to watch. I need to watch them. And then I spent a lot of like my first year of uni getting through movies, finding like types of movies I like. And then finally, when it hit this like gothic fiction interest, it was like, okay, now it's horror movies. And it was that year that I started doing the thing of between September and October, I will watch as many horror movies as I can, and I do that every year, and I still do it every year. It is that's my shit.
Yeah, a spooky season.
Spooky season, indeed.
Highlight of the year.
It really is.
I mean, it is very fun to do like these themed kind of watches where you just consume a bunch of stuff about one particular thing that you've been interested in for a
Mm.
while. I did spooky season last year. Uh, it was I probably bit off more than I could chew, but it was also very fun. And just like you say, you have all these movies that you've been meaning to watch for such a long time. Just getting those over and done with and having them under your belt is also kind of a cathartic feeling at some point.
Yeah, yeah.
Uh,
I definitely hit a thing with films where like, and I sometimes I have to like step back where I get a bit too completionist with it, and it's like, oh, I've got to watch all of these movies so I can say I've seen all of these movies, and then like I step back, I'm like, well, there's also these movies I want to watch,
yeah.
so
I mean, horror doesn't make that easier either, right? Because they have like
no.
17 sequels,
Hmm.
like direct to
Yeah.
video garbage, $5 budget. Do you remember what was like the first either like horror movie or like part of horror that you got into? Because horror, it's like this huge thing nowadays, right? You have really old school horror with like Bram Stoker's Dracula and Mary Shelley's Frankenstein uh and all of these really old like freaky monster dudes. And then you
Yeah.
have, the slasher era, right? Which was
Mhm.
huge. Uh
Slashers was huge. Yeah.
and then at the same time you've also have like this constant of more artsy stuff coming out in between all of the time.
Mhm.
Do you remember what was the first like this is where I need to start?
Hmm. I mean, I remember the first when I first like, so I guess like 2016 when I was like, okay, I want to like finally start checking out some horror movies. I watched The Witch, um, which I thought was super cool. Like, I think it had come out that year in the UK, um, and I was like blown away by how cool this movie was, and like the just the general vibe of it was super interesting, and also tied into a lot of my like interests that I'd find later on in like gothic fiction, of this being very rural, this being very like all about the collapse of established norms and things, that sort of thing.
Hmm.
um so The Witch was the first I like properly sat down and watched. I remember watching Halloween, which of course, like Halloween is a classic. It is definitely one of those movies that has aged weird just purely because everything that came after it kind of built on it. So the
Yeah.
movie in question is it's a tricky one to like show people if they're familiar with horror but have some reason never seen Halloween, because it's like, yeah, this movie isn't quite as groundbreaking as you'd expect, but like for all the stuff it does is like super interesting, especially if it's like one of your first horror movies. It's like kind of a
Yeah.
crazy movie.
It's
Um,
like regardless of genre, some movies have to be appreciated based on what they were.
Yeah,
It's like
no,
a
for
big
sure.
thing, and it's not something that everyone necessarily understands. Uh,
Hmm.
but I think for a lot of like horror, especially because like we briefly mentioned it, but horror has so many like cult classic films, which are like
Oh yeah,
old overlooked films that then gained like a resurgence of popularity. Is how I've understood that term to be used. Uh,
yes, yeah,
and it's like a lot of those movies aren't necessarily great nowadays, but for the
no,
time they were really good. Uh,
yeah,
or groundbreaking in some other way, right? They did something that no one else had done before, or something like
yeah,
that. And Halloween is definitely one of those.
yeah, for sure. And like, um, it's just like the progenitor of so much stuff as well. And while stuff like Black Christmas came before it, and I think Black Christmas is a more accurate representation of what slasher movies became,
Hmm.
Halloween is undoubtedly like, incredibly influential. Everything wanted to be Halloween. Um, and like that was like the trajectory of slashers as well. And then like Elm Street came out the next decade and like blew everything open because, oh yeah, you can also have this freaky guy who wisecracks at you while he does crazy over the top kills.
Elm Street's such a funky movie.
It is. I watched it again recently and it's wild.
Like I still think the dream scenarios presented in that movie is some of the most like creative, uh,
Yeah.
like frightening
Hmm.
things that I've seen on cinema.
Yeah. The Elm Street movies are. I mean, Elm Street is, as you said, like the countless sequels and stuff. Like Elm Street is definitely victim of that. Um, like everything that kind of makes Freddy scary goes back to being like, oh yeah, he's the funny guy who does funny things. You get Super Freddy, you get Gamer Freddy, you get all the different just like over the top goofy shit that kind of diminishes the actual fear that you get in the first movie. Um, but yeah, like First Elm Street's just so good for the conceptual dream stuff.
Hmm.
Um, just purely like the idea of, oh yeah, you can't sleep, oh this guy gets you, is just so good.
Yeah,
Such a like
exactly.
effective concept. Um, Something that is just like I'm again watching it again for like the fourth time recently of like, fuck, this really would just be the worst. It's so effective of like, could I physically stay up long enough to solve the mystery of everything and figure out how to tackle this.
Yeah, it's like Elm Street is like more than its contemporaries of its time that I've seen. It's like a just deeply unsettling and terrifying to imagine being in that situation. Like
Yeah,
obviously being chased down by Michael Myers isn't the best way to spend a Friday evening, right? It's like
no,
uh he never dies, right? That's the big thing.
yeah,
But at the same time it's like I could think of a couple ways to get out of that.
yeah. Well, I mean, like Michael Myers is a guy. I mean, like the later Halloween movies will kind of like expand the mythos of Michael Myers, but in the first movie, he is a uh, obviously there's some questionable depictions of mentally ill people in that movie, but like the idea of Michael Myers is he is the failures of the village of the town he grew up in, and them trying to bury that. And a lot of it is very conceptual in that way, but also he is a big guy who is going around killing people in a village localized on one night. Elm
Yeah.
Street is like this big conceptual thing of, yeah, this is a guy who died and is now haunting people through their dreams and
Yeah, and
uh
also just like
there is no escape, that you can't just run away from him. It is like,
yeah, there's no escape, and it's also so isolating because
mm,
it only affects these kids, uh,
yeah,
and like there's a similar thing where like all of the adults obviously want to forget everything related to Freddy Krueger and kind of uh,
yeah,
and just on that conceptual level of like I'm completely alone in this. I can't go to sleep. I have to watch my friends die, right? uh,
Yeah.
and obviously because sleep isn't like eventually you will fall asleep. That's just how it works. That's how the human body works. And there's a funky guy in your dreams who says boo and like does a Edward Scissorhands on you. The slasher era in particular, I think, because it was a long time and it was so huge at the time.
Yeah.
Obviously, I think that's where a lot of people's minds go to when you talk about horror movies.
Oh, definitely.
Like I think if I talk to my mom, maybe, or people older than my mom, they would probably go more to like the what are they called? The fish guy who lives in the swamp and the mummy and
Oh,
Frankenstein and
yeah, yeah,
Dracula and those guys, right?
yeah.
But the more modern uh take on horror, like anything post boomer, I think you go
Yeah,
to Jason and Freddy and
yeah.
Michael and occasionally some other neat stuff as well.
I mean, they just defined like even now we're getting this like horror, the slasher revivalism in over the last like decade. Like we've got a new Texas Chainsaw, we've got a new Scream, we've got a new or multiple new Halloweens. Like Saw's back. I mean, I guess Saw's is like from a different era, but like all of these like slashers are coming back because they still remain so prevalent in like pop culture.
Yeah. I think a big part of that is just like they have this one character who is very
Yeah,
memorable, right? Like
yeah.
because that's the stuff we remember from the olden horror as well. We remember Dracula. We don't remember anything else.
No.
We like people don't even realize that it's about Frankenstein's monster and he's the misunderstood guy, right?
Yeah,
It's very strange.
yeah,
And then obviously you also have in that time frame all of these movies that never made it to cult classic that were just forgotten.
yes.
Uh, you already mentioned Black Christmas,
Hmm.
which is like that is a cult classic, but not near the level of these other guys.
Hmm. No, for sure.
And conceptually, I think that movie is just so fucked up.
It is. It's just effective. It does like what Halloween does, but just such a like. There is a guy in your house. It's
Yeah,
not
I
like
am
it.
way more afraid of the guy
What?
in Black Christmas
Yeah,
than Michael
and
Myers.
yeah, Black Christmas does something really good, which is it shows you the kills from the jump without anyone knowing about it.
Yeah.
Like which does become a staple of like opening on kills and things, but like there is a like in Black Christmas. I mean, spoilers for Black Christmas, but like there is someone dead in the attic for like the majority of that movie that doesn't get found, and that's what I think is like something that's really cool in horror in slasher movies in particular is when there is stuff happening that people just don't know about, and yet they are still being like terrorized by something, and it's like plausible deniability, except there is someone dead in the attic.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Uh yeah, like these uh like the slasher era obviously had its downfall later on
Yeah,
when things became more homogenized and formulaic and uh it became sequel upon sequel and like you already mentioned kind of the flanderization of Freddy Krueger, uh
yeah,
him becoming a goofy guy. I think at some point it was also like meta humor became a way to try and still be cool with the kids who had realized that horror was
yeah,
or had decided, I guess, that horror was like dorky.
yeah. Which is what mostly came out of Scream. Like Scream is like literally is considered the start of the next wave of slasher movies because it was taking um slasher tropes and was specifically poking fun at like how kind of homogenous they'd become, while crafting what is a essentially a very well done slasher movie. But then of course every movie that came after it had to be the wisecracking meta humor horror movie,
Yeah.
like that kickstarted another wave that did not last nearly as long, did not create nearly as many iconic characters, but like you know, as you said, like they had to find a way to keep things fresh and like, well, like ironic humor and meta humor and stuff, that sort of thing has become the solution.
Yeah, and Scream also was particular in that s- so many things intersect to make Scream what it was, right? It came out at
Yeah, of
precisely the right time, and it was made by precisely the right person, right?
course, yeah.
Like Matthew Lillard goes so hard in that movie.
He does, yeah.
Uh,
It's got like the iconic final girl.
yeah, yeah, exactly. It's groundbreaking in that way.
Yeah, Sydney Prescott is, I think, honestly, probably the most like you can make arguments for like Laurie Strode, but I think Sydney Prescott consistently is like gets to do cool shit. She gets to be like a really good final girl. Um, More so than I think like most get to do, and I think that's another thing that just brings it how a classic is, like the fact that she can come back in the new one. As much as I don't love the new Scream movie, like there is like an iconic cast aside from Ghostface. Like Ghostface is a cool concept as well because he is anyone. Like it, anyone takes on the mask at any one time for the movie, and Sidney Prescott is the consistent one, which I think is
Hmm.
a really important thing. If you're going to keep the same kind of central um, protagonist, you've got to like make her good, and they definitely like Neve Campbell's so good, like as Sidney Prescott.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And I think Scream it hits that sweet spot between being like, yeah, we're kind of poking fun at what has come before. Uh,
Hmm.
and obviously Wes Craven is qualified to do that because he was part of what came before. Uh,
Yeah,
but also like we also see what was good about that and we want to bring that back, but we also want to do this funky new shit like having you know Sydney Prescott be who she is, or
yeah,
having like doing the complete opposite of what had been done before, which was make these dangerous guys who are just like more and more immortal and uh, silent and menacing, and
uh-huh.
have, like you say, Ghostface. He's more of a concept. He's more of a whoever can be Ghostface.
Yeah,
And all it takes is just like for a person to go mental. Uh, it's just like such a good simultaneous culmination and like what do you call it, like something that ushers in a new age, I guess.
yeah, yeah.
But yeah, that's Scream. We obviously like that movie. I think we got sidetracked at some point from what we were discussing and just talked about slasher films. But
I
yeah,
could talk about slashers forever. They're just so
the
cool.
slasher era, like as little as I've gotten into it, like I tried to watch the first movie of a bunch of them at least when I did spooky
Hmm.
season. But it's so much fun and it's
Yeah,
so effective and just like good movies from that time.
yeah.
I think the question was what was your first big horror movie? Uh,
Oh
and then
yeah, yeah.
we spun off from there. Obviously, I've gotten into horror more properly recently, just as I've been getting into movies more properly recently.
Hmm.
But I remember like when I was a teenager, like 14, 15, 16, we were a group of people, and like I mentioned before, like we'd get together, we watch horror movies because that seemed like something cool to do. And I guess that's like the era that came after the slasher era of like a bunch of more, I don't know, they were still kind of mass produced in the same way, like
Hmm.
Hollywood imitating itself, but they weren't about there wasn't a focus on the killer as much as uh it was a focus on like the family, I guess. More like
Yeah,
poltergeist-esque films started becoming
yeah.
popular. So we would watch, stuff like Sinister, stuff like and I'm not saying we watch good stuff. Like I don't think Sinister is like the pinnacle of horror cinema, but at the time I thought it was freaky as hell. Uh,
Yeah.
the Babadook I remember was a big one at that point in time. I eventually watched The Conjuring, which I still stand by as one of the scariest movies. Period. Uh, but now that I'm more into horror, uh, like now that I actually watch it because I want to watch it, there's
Mhm.
so much more to the genre than just being scared as well.
Oh yeah, yeah, for
Like we've
sure.
already talked about how they can be freaky and they can be funny and they can be uh, everything in between, but also they can be like uh, I mean, I'm going to sound pretentious on occasion in this podcast. That's just how it is. But they can be uh, deep, right? They can be
Oh yeah, yeah, for
about
sure.
stuff. Like every movie is about stuff, obviously, but they can be very like well thought through in their messaging and stuff like that. Uh, Ari Aster's Hereditary, I think, is a good
Mhm.
example to bring up
Oh yeah, definitely.
as a horror movie where obviously there's like freaky stuff going on, but the primary unsettling part of that movie comes from the family dynamic presented.
Yes, yeah.
And that's just like, because horror often gets a bad reputation from a certain subset of people. Like, I
Mhm.
often have to field questions when I talk about horror movies with my friends. That's like, I don't get what the point of horror is, people will say, or I don't get how you can watch that stuff. It's like usually I don't really give a response, or I give a very pretentious response that don't bother me anymore. But it really is like there's so much more to horror than just being spooky,
Yeah.
or and also like depending on who you are, uh, horror can be so many different things as well. Because like we started this podcast by talking about our first experiences with horror, and just having those experiences, like you with Indiana Jones or me with Lord of the Rings, that can kind of shape how you associate with these things
Mm.
in your adulthood as well. And I don't know, like, what do you think is the main draw of horror for you nowadays?
Nowadays, it's I'm at present. I'm like really interested in the kind of corners of horror that don't get talked about because they get kind of brushed off. Like I'm really interested at the moment in like shot on video stuff, stuff that was just like made by a bunch of people for their own use. That was just like ended up in video stores and then subsequently ended up online like 3 decades later. And a lot of shot on video stuff plays with like video in a really interesting way in that like so much of it feels like you could be watching a snuff film. um and it like often tends to be a really good way of like kind of masking crappy special effects to make them look pretty well done, which is really interesting. I love seeing like gore done on shot on video stuff because of how low quality what you're seeing it on looks like. It
Uh-huh.
does actually end up being pretty effective. Obviously, it does still look very fake, but like there is a very certain like kind of lens that you end up like physically looking through when you watch shot on video stuff that has a really effective um, appeal of how one I love movies that are just made by a bunch of people in the woods. I think those are like the best movies. Like if you've got no money and you've got the woods, like you can make the best movie ever made. Like that's just
Someone
consistently the
already
case.
did, actually. It's called the Blair Witch Project.
Exactly. Blair Witch Project versus Evil Dead, all of that stuff. Like if you've got no money and you got the woods, you can make the best movie ever made. That is just like that's a fact.
Hmm.
Um, but also like they tend to be like one thing I think not being American I kind of miss out on is a lot of these shot on video stuff end up being hyper regional. Doing like research is like, oh yeah, this was made in like this backwoods area of Minnesota, and it's like super iconic for that area. And it's like, damn, that's super cool. I wish I like had that context
Yeah.
as someone not from America, but like as as being able to film things became more prevalent for people, and like having a handheld camera was like groundbreaking for this sort of thing because anyone could make a movie, and there's a lot of people with a lot of like really imaginative ways of doing things making movies, and that's where a lot of shot and video stuff has the appeal. um and it also kind of ties into the whole culture of video stores, which I think is really cool. um the idea of going to a video store and picking up some wild looking horror movie and going home and having a watch party for it is just like a bygone era, but like still such a cool culture that exists that you don't really get even with like some of the big slasher movies. Like I know famously like Texas Chainsaw is a big one on video. How that is like on video, that's one of the scariest movies ever made. Same with like Alien, because like the format of video just hides so much. There's a lot of like stuff
Yeah.
hiding in the crunchy bits of video that you don't see. That when you scale it up to 4K and watch it on a big plasma TV, you like entirely lose out on. And like I know people who have watched like them in both ways, and it's like, damn, this movie is like legitimately amazing on video. I didn't love it when I saw the 4K release of it, which is like, yeah, that makes sense. Like
Yeah.
these movies were made to be watched on a tiny CRT on video with like kind of terrible audio quality. Like you try and scale that up, you lose something. Like video, like horror is like 80% mood, and you lose so much by crisping it up and polishing it almost.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Like the one thing that everyone suggests for people who are easily scared, right? That's to watch a horror movie on mute or on low volume,
Oh yeah,
right?
yeah,
Because the ambience makes you scared. The
yeah.
guy jumping out and saying boo isn't what makes you scared. The
Uh-huh.
gore effects isn't what makes you scared, right? Those can be freaky to think about,
Yeah.
but it really is, like you say, the mood. Any horror movie can be made. Like that's one thing I hate. Like obviously I hate everything that has to do with, you know, overly negative analysis of media
Oh yeah,
that kind
yeah.
of became popular around the internet age, right?
Hmm.
Cinema sins esque stuff.
Yeah.
One thing I hate to see is people dunking on a horror movie as being not scary. One, they're like watching it with their friends and constantly joking at the same time.
Yeah, they're looking at it. They're on their phone while they're watching it, and it's like, yeah, you're like, I mean, like, I have my phone out when I'm watching movies all the time because I have a terrible attention span.
Oh yeah, same.
But like, it's one thing to do that and then also be like, oh, this movie wasn't scary. It's like, yeah, because you're not watching it. You're not
Yeah, and
like,
it's also like sometimes a movie isn't scary, but it's still a good horror movie as
yeah,
well.
that's the
Like
thing.
it's such a you're taking this huge genre and you're making it such a small thing just to seem
Yeah,
smart on the internet, right? It's like that tweet where it's like, I could condescendingly summarize the movie, therefore it's bad.
yeah. I
Uh,
think, yeah, I think a lot of people's exposure to horror is like, I mean, it's totally valid exposure to horror is like, um, stuff like the kind of late 2000s haunting movies. Like Conjuring is like a big example of that, of like,
yeah.
it's marketed as the scariest thing you'll ever see, and people go and see it, and like they're like, I mean, yeah, those movies are like, depending on how easily scared you are, those movies are scary. Like,
Hmm.
but I think a lot of people have like that is the only type of scary movie. Therefore, these older movies that are like I'm now watching in a polished Blu-ray setting with the lights all on are not very scary, and that's because like you're missing a certain element of context there. You're missing like the certain vibe those movies are going for, like the Blumhouse like ghost movies that are definitely super popular are not doing the same thing as like Elm Street was doing, that Texas Chainsaw was doing. Like,
Yeah. I think a big victim of that, in my experience, is the Blair Witch Project. Like we
oh
mentioned it
yeah,
several times already. Like I've talked to friends about Blair Witch Project who aren't as into movies as I
mhm,
am, or definitely not less like into it as you are. And like the one thing that people will say is about the movies, like I didn't think it was scary. It's like, well, for the like first off, you can have more takeaways from a movie than just whether it was scary or not. Uh,
Yeah.
but also, like you say, there's so much context that the person is missing. Like, and I'm not gonna get into it, but I urge anyone listening who isn't aware to like read up on Blair Witch Project, how
Oh
it was
yeah.
made, how it was marketed, how it was all of these things, right? And you'll be asking
Yeah.
yourself how that was even legal. Uh,
Blair Witch, and we'll have to do a full episode on Blair Witch and that sort of thing
uh-huh,
at some point because Blair Witch is another movie like all these slasher icons that have just become so ridiculously influential that the
uh-huh,
impact of the original is diminished because like shot because found footage became huge. Like
exactly.
that was like the go-to. Like even there's a Dawn of the Dead sequel that is shot on video, not shot on video. There is found footage. There's stuff like Cloverfield that is found footage, and found footage became this like almost like path to make kind of a shitty movie. It was like everyone wanted to make Blair Witch but didn't get Blair Witch.
Yeah, I think that's a big thing with like found footage, particularly, is like people didn't understand what was good about Blair Witch, or what
Yeah,
was good about how they used the found footage. Which, like, funnily enough, like the whole reason it's found footage and that it is effective found footage is because they had budget restrictions, right? That's so
yeah,
funny to me. Uh, and also, like, you can't make found footage with a big budget almost, like, because a good camera doesn't work for found footage.
yeah.
The paranormal activity films were huge in like the
Oh yeah, that's another
2010s.
example. Yeah, those movies are huge.
They were massive.
And they again, they are movies that got like entirely memed on because they are like very easy to joke about, but like again, like there is a certain context there that makes them pretty scary.
Hmm.
Or like even scary. Like I tend to look at horror of generally not at like how much it scares you, but like what it makes you think about are the kind of I guess it's why people get like nightmares of horror movies generally. It's not because there's a scary guy, it's because what that scary guy is making you think about.
Yeah,
Um, like going back to Elm Street, like, oh yeah, it would be totally fucked up if I had to stay awake for like days on end because like I would die if I went to sleep. That's like fucked up. Blair Witch
yeah.
is another one of like, you know, be like I mean as someone who's done a lot of outdoor stuff as a kid and as a teenager, it's like yeah, that is always one of those anxieties of like making sure you know where you are because you can very easily get lost, and then it's like imagining being with a bunch of friends and your relationship with them deteriorating because like you fucked around and got lost in the woods.
Uh-huh.
And also there is like there's a lot of fear of the unknown, and like granted in Blair Witch there is an actual witch that is fucking with shit, but like there
Well,
is
we don't know if it was a witch, to be
well
fair.
yeah, that's the
Not
thing,
in
yeah.
the first one.
Not in the first one. The later movies will make sure there was a
I
witch, but
haven't seen the
yeah.
later movies, but I want to do it in like a masochistic kind of way.
Blair Witch 2 is a movie I've been told to watch so many times of just
Uh-huh.
like very different experience, not necessarily a good experience, but like if you appreciate early 2000s turn of the century stuff like I do, it's definitely worth a watch apparently. So I need
I
to
think Blair Witch 2 is on the top list of like movies, sequels that people don't know exist.
oh yeah, for sure.
Uh, I forgot what track we were on, but
About movies being scary and like kind of
oh yeah, yeah.
diminishing.
Yeah, like as adults, we aren't scared a lot.
Yeah.
Like we do like obviously like walking home at night, you're on edge, right? Uh
Yeah.
I wouldn't go into the woods at night alone either. Like stuff like that, of course, like that's scary. But I watched 30 horror movies last October. I was never sitting in front of the screen like, "Oh, this is so scary.
Hmm.
What if a guy gets me?" Right? But like you say, it's these conceptual things that stick with us, right? Like that's why I think Black Christmas is so effective
Yeah.
because I live in the attic, right? What if there's a guy here
What
and
if
I
there's a
just
guy in
don't
the attic?
know? And obviously, because like you know, there actually like literally have been cases where people were living in people's attics, like IRL. Uh,
Hmm.
which like that's a freaky thing.
Yeah.
That's also like why haunting movies are very effective for me. Why I think Conjuring is scary.
Oh yeah,
It's like,
definitely.
what if there's a ghost in my house, right? But it's not like, yeah, very rarely do you get scared while watching the movie. Uh, Alien, for example, that's not a movie that's like you watch it and it's like, oh, this is so scary because they're being chased by a xenomorph. It's like,
Hmm.
oh, this is conceptually scary because the space is vast and unknown,
Yeah.
and we don't know anything about it. Uh, like my biggest fear in life is the ocean.
Hmm.
Uh, and like space kind of follows that, right? Because it's the same thing.
Yeah.
And that is because it's like this huge, massive space that I don't know anything about, and I would be powerless within. Alien captures that very well. Uh, I haven't watched a lot of ocean-related horror. I've seen like Jaws, but that's not really the same thing.
Uh-huh.
Although Jaws does get me at some point. But yeah, like it's the concept that's scary,
Yeah.
and especially if you have like personal, like I don't know, what's your biggest fear?
Biggest fear, God. Like being just like entirely isolated. So I guess like ocean comes into that, but it's just
Mm-hmm.
like being in a position where you're like entirely in the unknown and there is just like literally no way of like getting hold of anyone. You are just like stuck.
Yeah, yeah, and like you said, that also like applies to ocean stuff or space stuff, right?
Yeah.
Being like Ripley being the only survivor of the whatever it's called, the ship. Like
Yeah.
that's fundamentally scary, being alone in space. You don't even need a monster to make that scary. And it's when you get these things, right? Where it's in part your personal experiences and what you're scared of, and also how well the movie evokes it, or the book, or whatever. That kind
Yeah.
of comes together to create this lasting sense of fear.
Hmm. And it's also like it's not necessarily what the viewer is scared of. It's also what the like themes the movie is exploring, what the specific fears that are eliciting in the characters is
Mm-hmm.
kind of interesting. Like when we think of horror being, I mean, even like gothic fiction wasn't conjured up to be scary. It was conjured up to explore like the more transgressive fears that society had. Like I mean, like Dracula is all about like fears of sexual freedom and that sort of thing. It's not meant to be scary in the sense of like you know it spooks you. It's meant to be like, damn, this is a societal ill that we need to address. And look, if we let people be sexually free, big scary vampire will take advantage of that.
Mm-hmm.
And then
Yeah,
like it's just that, hey, to market horror, it's got to be like, yeah, you won't sleep for a week when you watch this movie. Like
yeah.
it's
This is the most fucked up shit you ever see.
Yeah, but the thing is that also just comes with how like pop culture has moved. Like
Uh
to
huh.
get attention, to get like the attention necessary for a movie these days, and it's been the case like for decades. Like you need to be the scariest movie ever. You need to have all of the like post movie like vox pops of people saying, "Oh yeah, I was terrified. Like I had to leave the cinema.
Yeah.
I had to cover my eyes, my ears for the whole movie. It was so terrifying because that's
Yeah.
what gets people in. It's the challenge, and horror has in essence been diluted because of that. I think
Uh huh.
as much as that is a very valid, I think that's a very exciting part of horror is like challenging yourself to face some kind of scary stuff. A lot of horror, as we said about people finding a lot of movies not scary, it's kind of diluted what horror is. In the, less it's less the in the moment fear, and it's the like long lasting, like conceptual thoughts that like the movie wants you to kind of dwell on for a long time. But it is also scary when a guy jumps out at you.
That's true. That is scary.
Yeah, that's why screamers were so popular in the early internet. Like,
Uh-huh.
did you ever come across many screamers? Yeah, as a kid,
Yeah, I remember the car one. I
the
remember
car one.
there's one where they play the impossible game or something.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Uh yeah, I remember sending people screamer links instead of rickrolls.
Yeah, I think actually, I think Screamers might have been my first like proper exposure to horror. Like the car
Uh-huh.
one in particular. I remember being over a friend's house, um, and they had like a side room where they had the computer and stuff, and they closed the doors and stuff, and it was like showed me this video of I can't remember if it was the car one first or there was a similar screamer, but like it was the car one that is
Hmm.
the most standout, and it's like okay, what's this video? And then suddenly the scary zombie jumps out at you, and it's like literally that gives you a heart attack in the process. It's like
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
harrowing when
yeah.
you're a kid. And like again, another thing you look back on, it's like, damn, this has been so baked into pop culture now that like this is not scary at all. I know when the zombie jumps out, but I know if I see a car driving up a lonely road, I know yeah, there's probably gonna be a guy jumping out in like 5 seconds.
Yeah.
But yeah, like screamers are like a big part of that like um adrenaline uh extreme sport of horror movies.
Yeah. And there's definitely something to be said about like watching horror movies as like an adrenaline rush kind of thing. Like I
Yeah.
get that. I get wanting to feel alive, right? So you watch something
Hmm.
scary and push yourself out of your comfort zone. I would encourage people to do that maybe more often as well.
Hmm.
But I think like the stuff that you remember and the stuff that like makes you a horror movie fan, like I guess there are a lot of horror movie fans who just watch it for the experience.
Yeah.
Um, but I think what I'm more interested in is like people, because like there are so many die-hard horror fans, like more than any other genre.
Hmm.
I think with horror, and I think the reason you get that is because, uh, like you mentioned with Dracula, for example, and vampires. Um, I think horror is often at the forefront of a lot of interesting stuff and important stuff.
Yeah.
Aska mentioned to me yesterday, uh, they had this theory where, like, if you're really into music, you will eventually gravitate toward metal.
Hmm.
And if you're really into cinema, you will eventually gravitate towards horror.
Yeah.
And I think part of that is because of the huge, like, how much stuff there is within the horror genre.
Yeah.
Uh, like you've got all of these subgenres, and we've essentially labeled horror onto anything that is on the darker spectrum of emotions, kind of.
Hmm.
Like horror can be comedy, horror can be romance, horror can be everything, but romance can't be horror. That's kind of how I look at it.
Yes. Yes.
And also the people who make horror movies and horror movie media traditionally are kind of really into what they're doing. I think fantasy is another area where you see people who are like
Yeah. Yeah.
fanatics in that way. But like, you know, you look at people like The Fly with Jeff Goldblum, right?
Oh yeah.
The practical effects in that film must have been so difficult to make.
Yeah.
They're really good. They hold up today. You look at Alien, same stuff with like the marionettes in that movie. They're so large, they're so huge, they must have been so difficult to make. Like, imagine the dedication you need to come up with that concept and follow through with it.
Yeah. No, that is totally it. And I again, I think it's another thing of like in the age of big budget Marvel movies where like everything is done on a soundstage and it's all CG. There is a real charm to seeing incredible special practical effects in a movie made by four guys
Hmm.
over the course of like 6 months with like $1,000. It's I think horror more than any genre has those moments of like, damn, how the hell did they make this? So many like monster designs and like well done like gruesome bits and body horror that you look into the practical effects and it was like, yeah, there were four guys who made this. They had like, they had like 10K to make this movie, which is, not a lot of money to make a movie.
Yeah.
um and it's, I think, you get a lot of that with action movies and sci-fi movies especially, but like horror movies in general, like if you if you go hard on the special effects, you've got a cult classic on your hand.
Yeah.
Like,
And also, like, I've already mentioned this at least 5 times, I think. There are so many cult classics in horror, right?
yeah,
Like, mention one cult classic romantic comedy,
yeah, good point.
right? Mention one cult classic, uh, like, I don't even know, a fantasy movie, right? Fantasy
Hmm.
adventure. The Lord of the Rings, that's just a normal classic.
Yeah,
And then it's just a bunch of stuff. But horror movies, if you've heard of an old horror movie, it's a cult classic.
yeah.
And this is because obviously there's something there for people to latch onto even now. You look at The Thing by John Carpenter,
Hmm.
there's nothing else like it. You look at the first Alien movie, there's nothing else like it. You look
Yeah.
at Cronenberg's The Fly, or how Candyman, right? How it represents
Hmm.
racial tensions, and all of these things. There's nothing like it anywhere else, and it's all in the same genre as well.
Yeah.
But so
I
much
think
variety.
I think a lot of it is like just because of how transgressive horror was, and like in the UK, we've got the video nasties, which was a list of movies that were banned. Um, Predominantly all horror movies of
Hmm.
like varying degrees. Like some of them, you look back on, it's like, damn, they banned this. Like they banned the first Evil Dead, and it's like this is one of the goofiest movies ever made. Um, but like, you ban a bunch of media and then it's gonna garner like attention from those who like seek it out, but it's never gonna get the like commercial success because it literally can't.
Uh-huh.
um so that's why I think a lot of like horror movies fall into this cult classic area, while why like every now and then one from the past will get like this explosive receptions, because after all, this was a pretty normal movie and like could quite easily have gotten commercial success, but it was like banned, so
Yeah.
it wasn't able to. um but like when you get like, there's a lot of allure to like, oh, this movie was banned, like it's so fucked up, like you've got to seek this out, and then it's, again, it's like the challenge, it's the adrenaline, it's like, oh, I'm watching something that the powers that be don't want you to see, and it's
Yeah.
Texas Chainsaw or something. And it's like,
I also think
I,
that, like, when you have, like you mentioned, the video analysis, when you have this uh when you have movies, right? And you tell creators that, like, everything across this line is like, it's not as lucrative, it might be banned, right? It
mhm,
all of these things. The people who seek out that path are going to be passionate about that, right?
yeah.
Uh, and I think that's like part of the reason why oftentimes the most like high budget blockbuster horror movies, they aren't necessarily great, is
Mhm,
because you don't have that same, like, I'm making this film because I want to make it, because I have this great idea about how I can do
yeah,
it, or just because I'm a huge fan of horror movies, right? A lot of horror creators are fanatics with horror,
yeah,
and it's just like that sheer level of passion is just fun to see, and it's often like we mentioned, it shows through in practical effects, stuff like that. uh it's really fun,
yeah.
just generally.
That's what it comes down to. Like, horror more than anything is just a good time. Like, you
Yeah.
find yourself a bunch of like, you know, appear like movies that look kind of crappy, and they've got like the best special effects you've seen in any movie, and they've got like some of the goofiest acting you've ever seen, but it's like just like nails like a mood, and it like it's great. It's why every now and then, like, I think of like red letter media's like Wheel of the Worst and that sort of thing,
Hmm.
of like VHS tapes that no one remembers what this movie was, but like it's ended up in video stores and ended up in people's collections, and it's like just ridiculous shot on video action movie or horror movie, and like they're just a good time. Like it hits a vibe that is just you can't get from any other movie.
Yeah, totally. It's a shame that I guess it's gotten a lot better at that. But like traditionally, horror has kind of been looked down upon.
Yeah, it's one thing I say because I think there's a lot of distaste for the quote unquote elevated horror, like your Ari Aster's, your Lighthouse, all that sort of stuff.
Hmm.
And like I mean, I loved Hereditary. I love The Lighthouse a lot. Like those types of movies are just as valid as anything. And I think a lot of the conversation around them being like, "Oh, horror is like artful now," is like absolute bullshit. Like horror
Yeah.
has always been artful. It is always like nothing has changed about horror. It's just now appealing to a slightly different audience that is more likely to seek out like horror movies than they were before. Um, but also, it's bringing more attention to horror movies. It's getting more people into like seeking out what like if an Ari Aster movie gets popular, people are more likely to go, okay, well, what movies does Ari Aster like? And it's
Hmm.
like, oh, it's all these like transgressive horror movies from 50 years ago. And it's like, okay, well, now those movies have an audience. So while I don't love the conversation around a lot of these movies, like it brings more people into horror as a general thing, and they get why horror is appealing, and they kind of can look at horror from an angle that like old horror movies from a more artful angle and understand like yeah, these movies were huge. They are like arguably some of the biggest movies ever made, like for how they've shaped pop culture.
Uh-huh.
And like I want more movies. Like I don't care how good like these more artful horror movies are. Like I don't know, some of them I don't particularly love, but like I want more of that because it means more people finding out that this shot on video bullshit from 1985 is like the best shit ever. That's
Yeah.
that's that's all I care about. I want more people to watch nonsense, and the more the more artful quote unquote horror movies that come out, the more people are like, they get into that they get the itch, and that's where it starts. You get the itch, you watch all the classics, and it's like, well, fuck, what am I going to watch? I need to watch Slugs 1988, as you should.
Yeah. Exactly. Like it's a great time to like horror movies.
Yeah,
Like or to get into it as well. But like there's so much stuff that has been made, and there's so
yeah,
much stuff that I look forward to being made. Like you mentioned Ari Aster, I'm really excited for whatever he puts out next, right? Like
yeah.
I'm contractually obligated to like Midsommar. uh, I love Hereditary a lot as well. Uh, I just like things are coming out,
Yeah,
and I'm here for it. And there is so much that has already been made that I can go back and watch, and that just makes me excited as well.
yeah.
Like horror's
Like,
just in such a great position, I think, right now.
yeah, I think it's finally come out of a slump. Like, it obviously hit a slump with slashers, and then Scream came out and kind of revitalized it for a bit, but very quickly as like the early 2000s new metal vibe of horror movies came out. And like I love that era. That is like a dated time capsule of an era, but I love it. But it was like really stagnant and like died very quickly. And then you get your kind of Blumhouse, James Wan haunting movies that kind of revitalized things, but it was very localized. And then finally now, like there is some really interesting stuff happening in horror that I think on a commercial level that is really really cool to see. Um, like I love The Lighthouse, for instance. The Lighthouse I
Oh
think is
yeah, Lighthouse is so good.
one of the coolest horror movies I've seen in a long time.
Uh-huh.
Um, because it's got, I mean, like, and I'm really excited to watch. I know The Northman isn't specifically a horror movie, but like it's it's by Eggers. It's got that kind of vibe, and I'm looking forward to these movies. And like, I enjoyed Jordan Peele's stuff, so I'm curious to see what his next movie's like. And Ari Aster's stuff was good, and like, yeah, like I get what people mean when it's like, oh, I hate that these movies are now being seen as artful when they've been artful all this time. But like, I also just welcome the fact that horror is getting a more mainstay like reception now. Like
Yeah,
I have been, we're it's just a good time to be into horror, as you said. And yeah, like for every old slasher reboot that comes out and is like kind of shit, that kind of sucks to see. But like for the same time, if we get a new, new A24 horror movie as the new Scream movie, I could literally talk for hours on how much I think the new Scream movie is misguided. But like, there's a lot of this A24 horror like distaste among horror fans. But like, you know, their new horror movies, their new horror concepts coming out, that is can only be a good thing.
exactly. It's like, okay, like Halloween got rebooted. It's not as good, right? It's
Yeah,
some people would say it's pretty shit. I haven't seen them, but it's also like they're making bank, and that means
yeah,
horror is making bank,
yeah.
and that's good.
That is good. Yeah,
Like blockbusters are always gonna make money, but
yeah, of course.
having more of the blockbuster pie be horror is good for the
Mhm.
entire genre.
Yeah,
Uh, and yeah, so I think horror is in a great spot right now.
definitely is. Yeah. But I will always love the kind of shitty movie flops. I mean, that's entirely what extra cinema is. It is, but all the movies that came out that are kind of interesting, kind of cool, but absolutely flopped at the box office, have like the worst critical reception, but
Uh huh.
still have interesting things. That's my shit. That will always be my shit. But like, yeah, I want movies, horror movies, to do well commercially because it means we get more horror movies. It keeps things fresh. Like I would fucking hate if we were still in the James Wan Blumhouse haunting movies like era. That would kind of suck because no one really cared for it, like generally.
Yeah, definitely. I kind of want to bring it back a bit before we end.
Sure,
Talk about stuff that isn't necessarily movie related.
sure.
Um, so I was thinking, like, I always love to hear about people's like IRL stories with scary stuff. Do you
Ooh,
have you ever had like a horror adjacent experience in your life?
ooh, that's a good question. Well, I did a lot because I was in the Scouts as a kid,
Mm-hmm.
so that's a lot of like, you know, especially in the winter, you meet up with the group at like 8 and you're in the woods. It's like, and you do games of like, okay, you're being hunted down by someone.
Uh-huh.
You gotta find a good hiding spot. You gotta strategize, and that in general just kind of like boosts your adrenaline of like there is someone literally coming after you. You've got to win the game. You've got to try and hide. You've got to try and keep on the move or whatever.
Yeah. Playing hide
That
and
is that.
seek in general as a kid
Yeah.
was just the most like it's like playing Outlast.
Oh yeah. Exactly. Yeah. That's always like kind of foundational of like an experience. Really, like anything that you're doing at night in general is gonna
Uh-huh.
have some element, like like yeah, like any time where you're kind of, I mean, granted, it's never good to feel like on edge and like unsafe when you're walking at night, but like there is a certain adrenaline to it.
Yeah, I
um
I think this like I think it's a good thing as well to kind of get in touch with that side of yourself, right?
mhm.
Because it's there's something very primal about being scared
Yeah.
that we don't experience a lot in our day-to-day lives. And it's like and that's what I usually respond when someone asks me like what's the point of horror? Is I'm like, well, it's nice to be able to get in contact with certain aspects of yourself in a safe and controlled environment,
Hmm.
right? Like it's the same like a lot of people like tragic movies or sad movies.
Yeah.
Like I don't enjoy being sad in real life. I don't enjoy being depressed, right? But sometimes I'll put on the most nihilistic like dark movie ever because it's nice to be in touch with those feelings still, right?
Uh-huh.
It's and that also applies for like we enjoy chasing and being chased while playing as children. It's fun in a way to get in touch with that. I wouldn't enjoy being chased by a predator,
Yeah.
But yeah, you were in the scouts and you were like being chased at night.
Yeah.
Yeah, that is kind of
That's
spooky.
like that's the kind of thing, like getting in touch with like nature, I guess, is like a big part of being in the scouts and stuff. Of like, you know,
Hmm.
you spend your Monday evening, a couple hours of your Monday evening in a field or in the woods. That's like that's standard. Or you go away for a week and you camp in a field, and it's like, a lot of it is like engaging with nature and that stuff, and like of course that comes with elements of being spooked. I
Yeah,
remember the first scout camp we went on, so I would have been about 11. um we went to a camp, like, it wasn't even a campsite, it was just a field, a farm, and next to it was a big forest. And there were we found that there were travelers. So there were Roma people camping out in the forest,
yeah,
um, and definitely disrespectfully to the travelers there. Like a lot of the scouts would like uh see how close they can get to the camp before they get yelled at, and like
uh-huh.
that sort of thing. But like, you're all like 11 to 14, and like there's a bunch of unknown people in the forest, and you already have your like established discrimination thoughts of like Romani people, because that's annoyingly a thing that happens in Europe.
Yep.
But like, you know, you're camping, you're meant to be like safe in your campsite, but there is a group of unknown people, and like you're using the woods as well. And like that sort of thing is like kind of foundational experiences. And like, yeah, that is like, we were definitely told to stop being shitty and like just concentrate on our stuff. They are just a group of people chilling out.
There's
Like,
something so British about just being a dick to immigrants.
well, yes, that is like, that is especially in the scouts.
Yeah.
Yes. That is
I mean,
a
I'm not saying it would be better here. Uh,
no,
Probably
well, I
not.
mean, like the history of Romani discrimination is unfortunately continent wide.
That's
But
true.
yes, that is certainly a British experience of that sort of thing.
Yeah.
I think I remember one guy who was definitely overstimulated, running into the forest with a sledgehammer that he probably shouldn't have been using. Um,
Probably not.
uh, yeah, I think he would have been like 13, and then getting yelled at. But that's the scouts. That is
Yeah.
purely, yeah, the scouts are there for you to pick up an axe and realize very soon that you probably shouldn't be holding an axe, um, or that you should be holding an axe. Like, that might be a realization you have. Um, but yeah, that plays into the kind of spooky unknown. Very unfortunate to the group of travelers who were there, who I'm sure were just living their life on the move,
Yeah.
and got invaded by like 4 dozen 11-year-olds.
Yeah. I mean, if it's any consolation, it would probably wasn't the first time kids were being shitty to them.
Yeah.
Uh, yeah. Have you ever have you ever brushed up against the paranormal?
Paranormal. Ooh,
Do you
I
believe
don't
in ghosts?
know. I want to. There is in literally just like 5 minutes away from me. There's this big old yellow house.
Yeah.
It's got kind of interesting history. It used to be a mental hospital, and there was a guy I went to primary school with whose parents are split up, and his mother had moved in with a quite wealthy guy who lived in one of the apartments in the house. And he had a very overactive imagination, and it was like, oh, my mother has moved into the old haunted mental asylum. um and he used to have like a very overactive imagination of what was in there. And I remember like having like long conversations with him of like the history of the place, and like there being, there's still like some of the more contained wards down like in the basement area. And it's like, I have no idea if that is actually true, but like, and we talked all the time about going over there. And even though it was only like 5 minutes from our houses, it was like, this is an isolated estate. You don't really want to be going over there in
Yeah.
general. But I remember like, that really got your imagination going of like ghosts and haunted areas, and like obviously that had quite the emotional attachment to him because his mother was like living there.
Yeah.
Um, but uh, yeah, I remember having like long conversations about ghosts there and like talking about how we should go over there. And granted, we were like 8, so like we weren't going to do anything without like having to go further than we probably should have been allowed to. But
Yeah.
it was a very very foundational experience, I guess. It's like those sort of conversations.
Yeah. I'm similar. I also want to believe in ghosts. My rational brain doesn't, but
Yeah.
I think somewhere I do. Like if I've watched a movie about a haunting, or if I hear someone tell a story about how they brushed up against ghosts, I
Hmm.
feel like somewhere I start to believe in it. Like, or I start to, I'm at least afraid of the possibility, I guess. But realistically, I don't think ghosts exist, and I've never had an experience with them.
Hmm.
Um, when I was a child, I lived in the forest. Uh, we had our house was surrounded by forest on all sides, and there was a road leading out, but we were at the end of the road, kind of. And growing up, me and my brothers and our friends, we would always play in the forest, right?
Uh-huh.
And uh, I don't know why we were allowed to, but we would just like walk a direction. And I guess my mom just counted on us not getting lost and being able to get back again. We did get lost a lot. Um, but a lot of the stuff that you mentioned earlier, like, came up a lot. Obviously,
Hmm.
like getting lost and getting angry at your friends, obviously, because you're stressed out and whatever.
Yeah.
But I remember one time we went into the woods and we just walked and we came across like a log cabin.
Ooh.
Uh, but like it was like the top half of the log cabin wasn't there. So it was just like the walls and the doorway, and there was no roof on it. And there was no path leading to it or anything. Um, and in the log cabinet, we found log cabin, not cabinet. We found like an office chair just sitting there, um, kind of in disarray, like it had been kind of eaten by insects a bit. And I just think back on that a lot as one of the more freaky experiences of my like childhood, because we never
Uh-huh.
found that cabin again, and we never found it before.
Oh.
And it's like probably it was nothing, right? Probably like an old cabin from a long, long time ago that at some point I guess they dismantled. But the fact that there was like modern furniture there, I don't know.
Hmm.
I don't know. I think about that sometimes. That's my uh that's my scary story from my childhood.
Yeah. I think isolated cabins are like they're a market that has unfortunately been like picked up by like real estate, and now if there are like isolated cabins, they've probably been turned into like six-figure like
Mm-hmm.
holiday homes. But like the idea of just coming across a cabin when you're on a hike, it's like, oh, should I use this as a rest spot to rest my legs, or is there a so does this belong to someone who would not like me, like finding me in their house? Which I guess is most people. I wouldn't like finding people in my house, but
Yeah.
it's different when you're in an isolated cabin.
Yeah, definitely. Like the woods in general is such a strange place.
Yeah,
I think as someone who's grown up around woods, like you mentioned, you were in Scouts as well. That kind of goes
yeah,
back to the whole Blair Witch thing. Like you kind of had to have
hmm,
experienced it to get it, right? Like if I was walking through the
yeah,
woods, like obviously I was scared shitless by finding half of a house, right? If
yeah,
I found evidence of people near me while I was in the middle of nowhere in the woods, I'd be scared.
yeah,
Like you're scared of everything. Like you hear bushes creaking.
yeah,
Uh, yeah. So I think a lot of people, like with that movie in particular, they don't really meet it halfway in that way.
hmm,
But yeah, you already mentioned that we have a lot of things to say about that film. That should probably be saved for another day. I think we should probably move towards ending the episode.
yeah.
I do have a quote here I'd like to read.
Sure thing.
This is from Clive Barker's Books of Blood, the first three volumes. In the foreword, um, he like this isn't the first release, so this foreword is like it's from '98, I think, and
Mhm.
he talks about like he's kind of dealing with some shit. He's getting old, right? He's looking back on his old writing, and he's not necessarily liking what that says about how he was back then, stuff like that. But it is a hopeful forward.
Mhm.
Um, so he went to the San Francisco Halloween parade with his sexy boyfriend, his demon boyfriend, cosplay boyfriend, uh, and it was kind of a formative experience for him. And he writes, "Here was the curious thing: watching the way people's eyes fell on my monstrous companion, the mingling of delight and revulsion. I began to remember what had made me a horror writer all those years ago. I had enjoyed eliciting that complicated package of responses, knowing the words I was putting on the page would stop people in their tracks, as my lover's curious beauty was now doing. Make them wonder, perhaps, if the line between what they had feared and what they took pleasure in was not a good deal finer than they'd once imagined." And I took this quote because I want to talk about Clive Barker at least a little bit. So I
Uh-huh.
had to force him in there. But I also think it's a great quote to just sum up what I think is so cool about horror, which
Yeah.
is like this whole idea of there's something like everyone has like this darker aspect of themselves. And I think it's very healthy to get in touch with that occasionally. And you're
Yeah.
not fucked up for doing it, right? It's natural. It's natural to be drawn to stuff like that. Like, do you have any experience with creepy pasta growing up?
Oh yes, absolutely.
Uh, my big one was the Lavender Town music from
Of
Pokemon
course,
Gen
of
1.
course.
I thought that was so freaky. Like, and I bring it up because there is like this natural draw to it that you don't feel like you should be having. Uh, but it's there anyway. And horror, like, is that. It's all of that. It's everyone's that all put together.
Yeah.
And yeah, I just thought it was a really nice quote. I think he's a great writer.
Mhm. He is, yeah. He's a big favorite of mine.
Yeah, a bit of foreshadowing as well. Listeners may find out what I'm alluding to at some point. But yeah, I suppose we should wrap it up. Thank you so
Yeah.
much for joining me today, Ali. I had a great
No
time
worries. It's
discussing
been
with you.
fun.
Yeah.
Always
Uh,
glad to talk about horror.
oh hell yeah, horror's so good. Tell people again where they can find you.
Yeah, well, my show X Cinema Club is available wherever you get your podcasts. We talk about mostly early 2000s genre movies, but we expand it out. It's anything that is like interesting to me or my guests that did not get nearly any commercial or critical success. Those are the parameters typically. But we talk about all sorts. We talk about horror. We talk about action movies, sci-fi movies, video game adaptations, all of that stuff. So that's Access Cinema Club that you can find pretty much wherever. And there should be some new episodes pretty soon, hopefully.
Mm-hmm. Both me and Aska have been on Extra Cinema Club. It's a great podcast. Uh,
Yeah,
a lot of the movies are really interesting to listen to because it's not stuff you've heard of. Uh,
yeah.
there's an episode on Silent Hill, the Silent Hill movie.
Hmm.
I really enjoyed it, especially because Elena brings this like energy of I'm going to show the world that this movie is actually worth watching. I
Yeah,
think
yeah.
that's really fun.
The kind of essence I go through is not necessarily good, but necessarily interesting.
Uh huh.
Like the fear.com episode I did with my friend Aya is a big one where like both of us spent the whole recording like, is this movie good? Probably not. Is this movie super interesting? Definitely.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's also a really good episode.
And that's always like that's the essence I always try and capture is like I want people to be like, damn, I wrote this movie off as terrible, but like you're making me think about it in a way that is actually making me want to rewatch it. That's what I want. I always want people to be like, God damn it, you're making me want to watch this terrible movie I saw.
Hmm. And like, because I love like people being positive about things they like. It's so nice.
Yeah.
Um, because I already mentioned this a bit, but like there's so much like shitting on things is cool. Like, uh,
Yeah.
it's cool to not enjoy things. It's cool to be able to condescendingly talk about something.
Yeah.
But what I really want is to hear, like, I want to talk to my friends about things they enjoy. I want to listen to my friends talking about things they enjoy. I want to get a new perspective on things that I dislike, you know? I don't want to convince someone else to hate what I hate. I want to be convinced that I should like it.
No, for sure.
And I think X's Cinema Club is really good for that reason. The Torque episode, especially. Uh,
Yeah, I wonder why you like that one in
yeah,
particular.
who knows? Uh, but yeah, you can also be found as Muggage, right? On pretty much
Yep.
every social media.
Yep, at underscore muggage on Twitter. That's that, and you probably find all my things. You can find me at Letterboxd if you're interested in my movie opinions. Which if you're listening to this episode, I would hope you come out of it wanting to listen to my movie opinions. But you can
Hmm.
find me at muggage on that as well.
Yeah. Um, but yeah, so that'll be it for this episode. All of the necessary information will, of course, also be in the show notes. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the podcast. I look forward to having Ali on in the future as well to maybe talk about more horror movies. I'm still working on getting Aska to watch the Blair Witch Project, but otherwise we can do another duo episode. But it could be fun
Yeah,
to have a bit of a trio going.
yeah,
But yeah,
definitely.
other than that, we'll be back in 2 weeks' time, hopefully with the episode on Helter Skelter.
Ooh.
Yeah. Uh, yeah. Have a good whatever time it is for the listeners. I should end this now. Bye.